I'm joined now by Save the Children's team leader inside Gaza, Casey Harity. Casey, thank you for joining us. What more can you tell us that you know about this current airstrike?
Thank you for having us on the show. As you said, over 80 verified. We're hearing reports of up to 100, possibly more, that were killed in this attack as they continue to verify the bodies. There are still bodies that have been dismembered, that are under rubble, that they're attempting to pull out. We know that these attacks are continuing. This is the worst attack since October, but there were 17 attacks in July that were verified, and we cannot normalize this. Nearly half of the population in Gaza is children. There were children living in this shelter, and we must stop the attacks against children.
Israel says that this was a Hamas command center.
What we know is that there were women and children living in this school as a shelter. We've seen that. We cannot verify Hamas activities.
Yeah, and where are those injured who have survived, if there were many survivors, being taken to? Because, of course, the health system in Gaza has virtually collapsed.
As you said, the health system here is collapsing. We're having difficulty bringing in supplies through the borders. Those have constantly been stopped at the border, searched at the border. Supplies are not allowed in. We're seeing overworked, understrained doctors and nurses. Bodies were taken to a local hospital, dozens of casualties, bodies that were burned, as I said, dismembered in this horrific attack. And doctors there are working tirelessly to do their best under nearly impossible circumstances.
Yeah, and you mentioned that a lot of these shelters are housing women and children. I've spoken many times to Save the Children over the last few months about the situation for pregnant women, breastfeeding women, young children, nursing children. What's the situation there now for the most vulnerable?
That's right. Nearly half the population, as I said, are children. And what we're seeing is that they are by far the most vulnerable in this conflict. If you look just at the blasts, children are 7 times more likely to die in an attack like this because their bodies are thrown farther, they're thrown faster, their bones bend, they have limbs ripped off. Children are dying.
We'll just pause and wait to see if we can get Casey back. She is, of course, speaking to us from inside Gaza. Casey works with Save the Children in Gaza, and we were talking about that Israeli strike on a school-turned-shelter in Gaza City. Israel says it was a Hamas command center. We know, of course, civilians were housed there as well, albeit if there may well be some Hamas fighters amongst them. We know that women and children were there. Gaza's Save the Children's Casey Harity was speaking to me. Let's see if we can reconnect with you, Casey. Can you hear me? And Casey, once again, we were talking about children suffering in this conflict.
That's right. And our connection here, communication here is difficult. Access here is difficult. I think everyone knows the situation here is incredibly dire, not just for communication, but for getting supplies across the border. What I was mentioning when we got cut off is that children are dying not only from the attacks, but from preventable diseases and from malnourishment, which increases their chances of dying of preventable diseases. So we're seeing that children are truly the most vulnerable in this crisis.
And Casey, how long have you been there, and what kind of situations are you coming across that you can share with us? Because it's so rare we get to speak to people inside Gaza.
I just arrived only 2 days ago, so I arrived just before this attack. Last night, in addition to the horrifying attack up north, we also had an attack under 300 meters from our guest house. A targeted strike happened there, so we're seeing this across Gaza. Truly nowhere is safe. I spoke to a family today that had been displaced several times. They were displaced again last night due to the attacks that were here close in this vicinity. The father in that family told me that he has a 6-month-old baby that was born under bombardment in Rafah, and that his 2 older children both have jaundice. And that's just one family. That's just one tiny example of the huge crisis that we're facing here.
And of course, it is, or it was, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. Now, those people confined to even smaller spaces. So concern not just for being killed or injured in this conflict. We know how many children have lost limbs in this conflict, but also for disease and other health conditions. And of course, Casey, the mental health aspect of this.
That's right. First, on the dense population, when a strike, even when it's targeted because the population is so dense, we know that other people are affected by those strikes. You can compare this to the population density in a city like London or DC. Think about striking a city there on one of the busiest streets at the busiest time. That's what we're looking at for the density of population in Gaza. For preventable diseases, we're seeing an increase in those. Sewage is nearly impossible to manage here, so we're seeing an increase in disease because of that as well. The mental health crisis, as you said, is increasing. We're trying to get in more support for mental health for children, but also for their caregivers who are struggling in this conflict.
And Casey, look, you are an experienced aid worker. You work with Save the Children. I can hear in your tone of voice just how difficult this is. How are you feeling about what you're seeing?
This is the worst I've seen. I've worked in Syria, I've worked in Iraq, I've worked in other places, and you cannot compare human suffering. And I don't mean to do that because people have suffered in conflicts across the world, but we're seeing a new level of depravity in this conflict. And we cannot let this be the new normal. We can't let attacks against children be the new normal. We're asking globally for people to step up, to demand a ceasefire, a definitive ceasefire. We're asking to stop sending weapons. Member states should not be sending weapons. And we're asking to open the borders so that we can get more supplies in. Our job here is to save lives, alleviate suffering, and we cannot do that while we can't get supplies in and when we can't access the population here.
Casey Harity from Save the Children in Gaza. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on Sky News today. Thank you. Stay safe.